Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of America's most influential civil rights activists. His passionate, but nonviolent protests helped to raise awareness of racial inequalities in America, leading to significant political change. Martin Luther King was also an eloquent orator who captured the imagination and hearts of people, both black and white. Early life of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta on the 15th of January 1929. Both his father and grandfather were pastors in an African American Baptist church. M. Luther King attended Morehouse College in Atlanta, segregated schooling, and then went to study at Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania and Boston University. During his time at university, Martin Luther King became aware of the vast inequality and injustice faced by Black Americans. In particular, he was influenced by Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent protest. The philosophy of Gandhi tied in with the teachings of his Baptist faith. At the age of 24, King married Coretta Scott, a beautiful and talented young woman. After getting married, King became a pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Montgomery Bus Boycott. A turning point in the life of Martin Luther King was the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which he helped to promote. His boycott also became a turning point in the civil rights struggle, attracting national press for the cause. It began in innocuous circumstances on the 5th of December 1955. Rosa Parks, a civil rights activist, refused to give up her seat. She was sitting in a white-only area. This broke the strict segregation of colored and white people on the Montgomery buses. The bus company refused to back down, and so Martin Luther King helped to organize a strike where colored people refused to use any of the city buses. The boycott lasted for several months. The issue was then brought to the Supreme Court, who declared the segregation was unconstitutional. Civil rights movement. After the success of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, King and other ministers founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. This proved to be a nucleus for the growing civil rights movement. Later there would be arguments about the best approach to take. In particular, the 1960s saw the rise of the Black Power movement, epitomized by Malcolm X and other black nationalist groups. However, King always remained committed to the ideals of nonviolent struggle. Speeches of Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King was an inspirational and influential speaker. He had the capacity to move and uplift his audiences. In particular, he could offer a vision of hope. He captured the injustice of the time but also felt that this injustice was like a passing cloud. King frequently made references to God, the Bible, and his Christian faith. And this is what Jesus means when he said, "How is it that you can see the mote in your brother's eye and not see the beam in your own eye?" Or to put it in Moffat's translation, "How is it that you see the splinter in your brother's eye and fail to see the plank in your own eye?" And this is one of the tragedies of human nature. So we begin to love our enemies and love those persons that hate us, whether in collective life or individual life, by looking at ourselves. Quote, Martin Luther King. His speeches were largely free of revenge, instead focusing on the need to move forward. He was named as Man of the Year by Time magazine in 1963. It followed his famous and iconic, "I Have a Dream" speech, delivered in Washington during a civil rights march. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at a table of brotherhood." Martin Luther King. The following year, Martin Luther King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his work towards social justice. King announced he would turn over the prize money, $54,123, to the civil rights movement. With the prestige of the Nobel Prize, King was increasingly consulted by politicians such as Lyndon Johnson. However, King's opposition to the Vietnam War did not endear him to the Johnson administration. King also began receiving increased scrutiny from the authorities, such as the FBI. On April 4, 1968, King was assassinated. It was one day after he had delivered his final speech, "I've been to the mountaintop." In his honor, America has instigated a national Martin Luther King Day. He remains symbolic of America's fight for justice and racial equality. How Martin Luther King Jr. took inspiration from Gandhi on nonviolence. The civil rights leader realized the power in Gandhi's approach to standing up to oppression with truth force. Quote, Mahatma Gandhi inspired people all over the world, including one of the United States' most famous civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King Jr. Though the two men never got a chance to meet, King was 19 when Gandhi was assassinated. King learned about Gandhi through his writing and a trip to India in 1959. King drew heavily on Gandhian principle of nonviolence in his own civil rights activism, writing that, while the Montgomery boycott was going on, India's Gandhi was the guiding light of our technique of nonviolent social change. Quote, "Nonviolence is a more than simply agreeing that you won't physically attack your enemy." Gandhi referred to his form of nonviolence as satyagraha, meaning truth force or love force. Practicing satyagraha means a person should seek truth and love while refusing, through nonviolent resistance, to participate in something she believes is wrong. This principle guided Gandhi's activism against the British Empire, helping India win independence in 1947. King connected Christianity to Gandhi's teachings. King first learned of Gandhi's concept of nonviolence as a seminary student. As a Christian, he connected the Hindu thinker's words to the biblical appeal of Jesus to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Quote, "I came to see for the first time that the Christian doctrine of love operating through the Gandhian method of nonviolence was one of the most potent weapons available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom," King later wrote. King was already familiar with peaceful civil disobedience through American writers like Henry David Thoreau, and he liked Gandhi's idea that oppressed people could use truth or love as weapons in their struggle for justice. But he didn't find a practical application for how to put it to use until he became involved in the Montgomery Bus Boycott of 1955 and 56. In his 1958 book Stride Toward Freedom, The Montgomery Story, King laid out the principles of nonviolence he'd employed during the boycott. He affirmed that it is possible to resist evil without resorting to violence and to oppose evil itself without opposing the people committing evil. He also wrote that people who practice nonviolence must be willing to suffer without retaliation, internal or external. The nonviolent resistor not only refuses to shoot his opponent but he also refuses to hate him. Quote, "He saw nonviolence as an expression of love for all people," says Claiborne Carson, a history professor and director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University. "It's a way of reaching people and convincing them of the rightness of your cause." Quote, "Shortly after the Supreme Court ruled that Montgomery's bus segregation was unconstitutional, King told a crowd in Brooklyn, 'Christ showed us the way, and Gandhi in India showed it could work.'" Quote, King wasn't the only civil rights leader who looked to Gandhi for inspiration. In the late 1950s, future Congressman John Lewis studied Gandhi in nonviolence workshops led by activist James Lawson. These workshops prepared Lewis for the sit-ins he and other students would later hold at lunch counters in Nashville, Tennessee. If you can understand and feel even in the midst of those critical and often physically painful moments that your attacker is as much a victim as you are, that he is a victim of the forces that have shaped and fed his anger and fury, then you are well on your way to the nonviolent life, Lewis wrote in his book Walking with the Wind, a memoir of the movement. He saw the legacy of Gandhi's leadership in India. To better understand Gandhian principles, King took a one-month trip to India at the beginning of 1959. There, he was pleasantly surprised to find that many people there had followed the nonviolent bus boycott he'd been a part of. During the trip, he met with Gandhi's son, cousin, grandsons and other relatives and laid a wreath on his entombed ashes. And he left even more convinced of the power of nonviolent civil disobedience to effect social change. It was a marvelous thing to see the amazing results of a nonviolent campaign, King wrote in Ebony after his trip. The aftermath of hatred and bitterness that usually follows a violent campaign was found nowhere in India. Today a mutual friendship based on complete equality exists between the Indian and British people within the Commonwealth. Quote, I would say that after he returned he was the most prominent living advocate for nonviolence, Carson says. He popularized a lot of the ideas that Gandhi had, but through King, they spread throughout the United States and, of course, came to other parts of the world. Quote,